Okay. All right. I've started the recording. We have enough people to get
All
started.
right.
So I'd like
Uh,
to.
let- let's give it a minute here.
Okay.
Let's see who else turns up.
Well,
Dina, hey, how are you? Hey, Dina.
Hi, I had to figure out how to unmute. Um, what does AI companion is on mean?
it probably means that your Zoom has like an AI extension to it. It usually is used to either tweak your image that shows up on our screens, or sometimes it's used to like help you with chat questions. Uh,
Okay, so I can basically ignore it.
yeah, you can basically ignore it. Uh,
Okay,
so while we're here,
now I'm
I might as
making
well
you bigger.
start with a quick ground rules for this Zoom. Laird is going to be presenting to us a whole bunch of new and fascinating material. He'll be doing so in a PowerPoint format. At any time, if anyone has a question about, they need clarification or they just don't understand something or want to know more, you can post your question in the chat. I will chime in with Laird to let him know that there's a question. Um, please keep questions short because even though this is set for long, we don't want to all be stuck here all day. So,
You can also just type the word question, and then we'll know that you want, because the best time to address a question is when I'm on the slide. If it's a complicated question, then we might want to hold it till later.
So, with that being said, Laird, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, let's see if I can get my screen to share. And then,
Okay.
okay, we'll see if, can
It
you see
take
John yet?
so no, I don't see John yet. It says double click to enter full screen mode. There it is.
Okay, well, that's the point where we want to start. Do you think I should start at this point?
Go right ahead.
Okay, well, those of you who knew John Anthony West realize that he noticed that science in ancient Egypt was perfect at the beginning, and then it got worse and worse and worse as time went on. And so he concluded from that Egyptian science must be a legacy, not a development. And so he made it his professional mission to try to be able to demonstrate the existence of high science in the eras preceding ancient Egypt, and that was sort of the quest he was on, along with a lot of his colleagues. So, one of the reasons I'm doing this presentation is because I'm at a point where I can close that loop, and so I want to do that. I have evidence that convincingly shows that we had high science before ancient Egypt. Now, the form that science takes, it's a form of hidden knowledge that Tibetan Buddhism calls terma. And in Tibetan Buddhism, the idea was that very long time ago, some Tibetan adepts intentionally hid certain knowledge that they expected to have come forward during what they call the end era, which they describe in terms exactly like what we've been experiencing. It's an era where human ethics decline and the actions of nations are questionable, and all the things we've been saying, climate problems and so forth. So this knowledge was, if you believe Tibetan Buddhism, was targeted for this particular era. And so there's such a volume of it that's come forward that I've been having a hard time even keeping up with it. Now, this also closes a loop for me because the first book I wrote, the first self-published book, was called Hidden Meanings. John Anthony West actually loved that title. So to have the cycle of the information play out in terms of a whole body of hidden meanings is wonderful. Now, in Tibetan Buddhism, the form that the hidden information takes, the typical form is it appears as sort of a sentence on a slip of paper, or it appears as a document that's turned up that nobody ever knew about, or it turns up as some esoteric object that's hidden in a cave, discovered underground, or something like that. What I have is essentially an entire tutorial on creational energetics, and basically plasma energetics. What I have is an entire complex of islands from ancient times that are conceptualized as a tutorial on human scale for us about these energetics and how they work. And so what the PowerPoint does is it walks us through the rationale of how that works. When we were in school, we were taught that atoms are the foundations of matter. And it's true that they are, but given what we know right now, starting with atoms is sort of like coming in the middle of the movie, or partway through the movie. So my entry point into the symbology is through the Dogon tribe, and their mission was to reduce fractions and to base definitions on the most basic forms. And so they enter the discussion a level earlier than atoms. They enter at the level of plasma physics. This is a picture of Marcel Griol, who's the premier French anthropologist who spent 30 years interviewing the Dogon. He was initiated into the Dogon tribe. He was granted Dogon citizenship, and when he died, 100,000 Dogon tribes people attended his Dogon funeral. The Dogon are a priestly tribe, and their societal mission is to preserve original symbolic forms, and they do that with their language. They preserve original words of cosmological language. They preserve original symbolic forms, and they have full understanding of what they're talking about, so they can explain it in modern terms. So it turns out to be a wonderful entry point for me to do a comparative study, because their society acts as a kind of umbrella over a number of classic esoteric traditions. Their language enfolds 18 subgroups of words from other languages, so that also makes them a great place to start. Now, the first thing the teachers among the Dogon tribe have to do in order to, because if they're talking about scientific information, which they say they are, the first thing they have to do is convince us that they know what they're talking about. And so the first thing they have to do is establish credibility for what they're saying. And the way they do that is they present us with images that are unmistakable, even though their perspective is that magnetism is given priority over electricity. One of the things they begin with is this image on top, which is a diagram of how unresisted electricity flows. And they anthropomorphize the concept into a character named Ogo. They anthropomorphize the concept of magnetism into another character called Ama. And so this particular diagram, because it's an exact match for the one below it, which is the scientific diagram of how unresisted flow of electricity works, this diagram all by itself should establish for us that the Dogon know what they're talking about and that it is scientific. They do some other things. They talk about basic dynamics of magnetism and electricity. They tell us that magnetism moves circularly and that electricity moves linearly. And the two figures on the left of the screen are called the Dogon guide signs. The Dogon read their figures the way Hebrew language does, from right to left. So the second of the Dogon guide signs, the straight line there, illustrates how electricity, when it's uninfluenced by anything else, tries to move. It moves linearly. The right side of the diagram shows us how magnetism influences electricity to actually move. And both of those are a match for the diagram on the right, which is a scientific diagram of how magnetism induces electricity to move. Again, a very intuitive comparison. The Buddhists refer to these symbols as adequate symbols. They represent concepts in nature that if you have the proper level of technology, a person can see and ought to recognize. The Dogen also talk about atoms, and they diagram an electron orbital pattern for us on the left that's comparable to the image from an electron microscope, which is the image on the right. As we get to know the system a little better, we realize that the Dogen have actually done a more intuitive job of diagramming how the atom actually works than the electron image does. In the Dogen conception, a hydrogen atom is a plasma bubble, and the electron, which we've never been able to image the orbiting of the electron around the atom, is actually just a passenger inside that bubble. And it's the bubble that rotates, not the electron. So around 1942, a Swedish physicist named Hannes Alfvén demonstrated the existence of something, a more foundational level of magnetism. When magnetic flux or magnetic, the strength of a magnetic field starts to weaken, or when it begins to grow from nothing, it produces something called, that it had been named after this physicist, they're called Alfvén waves. They are very fundamental waves of magnetism that move with plasma energy, which is liquid. And so wherever the plasma goes, the waves go. And the natural form of the Alfvén waves is as what are called longitudinal waves. They move in a single direction in a straight line, or they move along the magnetic lines. But if those longitudinal waves happen to hit an obstacle or under some other circumstances, they can get diverted from their straight ahead path, and now suddenly they're moving perpendicularly to the way they had been before, and they create what are called transverse waves. And in the esoteric traditions, the single most important effective energy occurs at the point where those two kinds of waves intersect with each other. That creates the form of an axis. With a Buddhist stupa shrine, Adrian Snodgrass says that the only symbolic aspect of a Buddhist stupa shrine that's really essential is the point of intersection of the two axes. The Alfvén waves exist in the corona of the sun, and they persist in high levels of our Earth's atmosphere, up in the range of the Birkeland current, some 60 to 120 miles above the ground in the Earth's atmosphere. The Alfvén waves also have the natural ability to create what are called beat frequencies. You know what a beat frequency is if you've ever driven your car on a highway and rolled down just one window. When you do that, you probably heard a whacka, whacka, whacka sound. That is acoustic waves forming beat frequencies, recurring beats. And the reason it happens is because when you have two waves of energy like magnetism and electricity, where as each energy moves, it evokes the other energy. And so the energies are moving persistently into and out of phase with each other. When that happens, there are two situations that occur. One is where the peaks and the troughs of the waves interfere with each other, and if you're talking about sound energy, the waves cancel each other out, and so the sound gets very quiet. Or they can reinforce each other when the waves and the troughs match each other, and that causes the sound energy to increase and get louder, and so you get a louder, softer, whacka, whacka, whacka sound. The same thing happens with any energy. It's defined in terms of sound energy because we perceive that readily, and we don't perceive some of the other energies readily. So now there's a more primordial form of the Alfvén waves called kinetic Alfvén waves. It's another level down from those longitudinal and transverse waves. And it takes the form, science diagrams it on the left, it takes the form of little short threads of energy that in the ancient tradition they compare to threads of flax. Now, in the center image, you can see that the Dogon have exactly duplicated that scientific image. They understand that the root form of magnetism is exactly what science understands it as being. This is another one of those intuitive images that should convince us that the Dogon, whoever put the Dogon system together, knew exactly what they were talking about. So the two images in the middle of the screen are figures that are carved into the wooden door frames of, not the door frames, the door panels of the top Dogon priest. He's called the Aru priest. So these are then the door panels of his house. The Aru priest symbolism is all about primordial scale levels of energy. And so the literal entry point to the Dogon priest's house is represented by the literal entry point to magnetism and electricity as energy. So we have the primordial form of magnetism on one door panel, and we have the primordial form of electricity on the other door panel. The far right image is a picture of what flax looks like. Now the Dogon also, okay, let's back up for a second. That each one of those little threads, how can I say this? In the Dogon conception, Amma, who is this character who's been anthropomorphized as magnetism, is credited with one specific action. Amma is the force that causes the two poles of a magnet, the north and south poles of a magnet, to be bound together. That's the same force and the same dynamic that delimits one of these little alphen threads, kinetic alphen threads. So Amma is fundamentally defined by one of those little threads. The Dogon also defined the domain where those threads thrive. It's called, on the left is science's image of the Birkeland currents. This is one of the domains of energy that sits above the, far miles above the Earth. And it's sort of a progression of energies, and the progression from inside to the outside of the figure recapitulates how energy actually materializes. So all of the phases that energy goes through as it tries to materialize is represented in these currents. On the right-hand side of the page is how the Dogon represent what they call the seat of Amma. It's called Amma Doi, which literally means Amma's seat. This is the place where the alphen waves are at rest, or where they're at most at rest. Again, they've gotten the figure exactly right. If we had any doubt that they know what they're talking about or that they're talking about science, this should quell our doubt. Now, those transverse waves that move in one direction, if they happen to link up with a second transverse wave that's moving in the opposite direction, it produces what's called a standing wave. A standing wave is what you get if you're trying to carry a big rectangular pan full of water in your kitchen and you're trying to get it to your sink. Chances are pretty good you've accidentally set up a standing wave with the water sloshing back and forth. That's a standing wave. A traveling wave is the wave that moves in one direction. That's the wave you get if you try to pour the water out into the sink. So these two types of waves are two energetics or two materialized structures, what we were taught atoms are. All of the structures are the consequence of the interactions of these two kinds of waves. And so up at the right-hand side of the screen, I show you one of the conceptions of what an electron structure is. It consists of a bunch of smaller structures called wave centers. And this is all the product of the interactions of standing waves and traveling waves. And the sort of extents of those two waves together is what defines the radius of the electron. The alphen waves are able to naturally produce three main shapes, and I have those pictured at the top left. If the alphen waves are in a state of energy that is basically stationary, they radiate outward and they produce a geometry of what we understand as being a hydrogen atom, or that's the same geometry as a wave center that makes up an electron. if the alpha waves are in a context that's moving, they can produce the almond shape in the center, which is one of those beat frequencies we were talking about. Those beat frequencies are what differentiate wave energy into quanta, discrete quanta. It's why we see energy as being both particle-like and wave-like at the same time. It's because the wave-like energy is self-differentiated into these discrete little units, the almond-shaped units. This is also the shape of the Vesica Pisces, which is an important symbolic element. Now, if the alpha waves are in a context of rotating in a space that is expanding, it produces a spiral, which is the third figure. And those three shapes pretty much define everything on all scales of energy that we observe as materializing forms. At the bottom left is another structure that the alpha waves are particularly adept at creating. It's called a plasma bubble. And it wasn't until last year that I was able to sort out that it looks as if a hydrogen atom is really a plasma bubble. That the different energy levels of the hydrogen atom, which only come about when a discrete quantum of energy is absorbed by the atom. The reason why we create that next energy level is essentially because we've expanded the bubble when we absorb the energy. And when we emit energy from the hydrogen atom, we were shrinking the bubble. And so you end up with 5 levels of energy in a hydrogen atom. You also end up with increments of the bubble. There are certain changes in the magnetic characteristics of the bubble that can cause it to expand just a little bit. And so you end up with what are called it's the fine structure of the atom. It's called the Zeeman effect, that creates little sort of incremental pathways for the electron that passes through the hydrogen atom. Now the Dogans say that AMA consists of 4 clavicles and only 4 clavicles. Beyond that, nothing exists. When they say that, what they mean is what I picture on the right. A clavicle is shaped like one of these little wavelengths of energy. And as I said before, those clavicles, those energies, can only do 2 things. 2 of them can interfere with each other destructively and sort of cancel out, or they can have constructive interference and then they magnify each other. So when the Dogans say that AMA exists of only 4 clavicles, that's what they're talking about. We're talking about how the waves interact. And again, the Dogan have it exactly right. And they use a very intuitive symbol from nature to illustrate it for us. In 1924, one of the top physicists named Louis de Broglie, he's a Frenchman, he was a French nobleman, authored a very pivotal paper that got presented at a conference. It was written in French. The reason the paper was pivotal is because he managed to prove mathematically that those energy levels of the hydrogen atom correspond to points of resonance for 2 energies, which is what a bubble also does. His paper was highly praised by Einstein, by Schrödinger, by a number of other top physicists. It actually became the foundation for Schrödinger's quantum theory. But de Broglie's paper got disappeared. It never even got translated into another language, even though it had the potential to unify quantum physics with relativity, quantum physics on a microcosmic scale with relativity on a macrocosmic scale. The paper itself got disappeared, and so did the entire concept of resonance. If you go through papers de Broglie wrote after 1924, he never mentions resonance. Einstein doesn't mention resonance. Nobody mentions de Broglie's paper. Almost 100 years later, a Quebecan physicist named André Michaud, who's an independent physicist, discovered the paper and publicized it and in a paper of his own. and quoted major points from the paper where de Broglie is saying some very important things about the energetics. One of the things de Broglie did was he graphed the two oscillations of energy that are cooperating to form the hydrogen atom. And what I pictured on the screen here are the two graphs that he produced. One takes the form of a zigzag line. That constitutes an ultra quick oscillation of energy. When I say ultra quick, I mean at 99.9% of the speed of light, so fast that we can't measure it, so fast that de Broglie treated it as if it were imaginary, not real. That oscillation occurs internally within the proton. It's a purely magnetic oscillation between components of the proton. The second oscillation is magnetically induced. It comes about because of the cyclical presence of magnetism for the orbiting electron, the electricity that's orbiting around the atom. And it produces the almond shape, which is the vesica Pisces shape. These are the beat frequencies. De Broglie refers to them in French as beats. He calls them battements. There's descriptions on the side here that explain what these oscillations represent. Well, I noticed that those two shapes, the shape of the almond, and the shape of the zigzag line, are prominent Egyptian glyph shapes. The almond shape is the Egyptian mouth glyph, and the zigzag shape is what I call the Egyptian single wave glyph. So I thought these are concepts that are way too important not to have been mentioned in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language. So I started looking for words that were written using just those glyphs. And what I came up with were these, among other things. The man at the bottom, Sir E.A. Wallace Budge, compiled a dictionary of Egyptian hieroglyphics that modern Egyptologists dismiss. They look down their nose on it. They think he didn't know the first thing about Egyptian hieroglyphs. They don't work with his dictionary. I know that Budge's dictionary is predictably in agreement with the Dogon dictionary, and the Dogon dictionary was developed entirely separately from Budge's dictionary in a different era than Budge published his dictionary. Budge did not take his information from the Dogon. And there are quite a number of words I've documented over the course of 15 books where the Dogon word is a very close match for the Egyptian word. Now, one of the very important things that's going on, as I've been doing my studies, there were instances where the material I was looking at looked more and more like my own work, so much so that it was confusing to me about why did it look so much like my own work. And I would think things like, if I had been the one developing this system, I would have been sure to give myself a way to know absolutely what the ancient words meant. And I discovered that the Dogon words, which are spoken words, the syllables of those spoken words act like symbols. Every syllable corresponds with a concept, what I call a root concept. And when the Dogon want to express a more complicated idea, they just mix and match the syllables, and they combine the right syllables together to express the idea. And now they have the word for the more complicated idea. And so if I know the original pronunciation of a Dogon word, I don't have to guess what the word meant. I can substitute concepts for syllables and retrieve the original intended meaning of that word. Okay, so Budge was working from a language that was like Hebrew, where the vowel sounds are not written. And so he had to guess what the proper vowel sound was for any word he was documenting. And so these glyphs that he came up with, and these words that are written with basically just two glyphs, he inferred that the proper pronunciation was Ren, because those are the phonetic, R and N are the phonetic values of the two glyphs. And he guessed that E would have been the vowel sound in between. But I know, because I've worked with both spoken language and symbolic language. In the symbolic languages, every glyph represents a concept, and the words work exactly the same way. If you substitute concepts for glyphs, you produce a symbolic sentence that explains to you what the original intended meaning of the word was. So I don't have to guess what the words mean. The words tell me their own meanings. And so the word Ren, I know, properly should be pronounced Rena, not Ren. Rena, Okay, the syllable Re means energy, and the syllable Na across many different cultures refers to the non-material feminine. So Re Na literally means energy of the non-material feminine. This is the primordial energy. These are the primordial energies that are associated with feminine energy in the ancient traditions. Budge considered this to be the divine name, even though in the traditions I'm working from, they're all expressly non-theistic. They don't, even though they use what we understand to be deities to represent key stages of the energetics, they didn't actually deify them. They didn't take the approach we do, where if there's a piece we don't understand, we feel like it's got to be God. That's not the way they looked at it. They looked at it as, here's a piece of the scientific aspects of the energies that somebody might not understand yet. So Reina is the proper name for this word, or proper pronunciation of the word. Now, the figure on top, the almond-shaped figure, defines a continuum of energy. When we have electrical and magnetic energies, they persistently move between two states. The first one state, and this is where the Dogen-say things begin, is a state where magnetism is unresisted and electrical flow is dormant. It's called a state of superinsulation. At the other end of the scale, at the other bookended end of the scale, we have the opposite of that. We have electrical flow unresisted, and we have magnetic strength dormant. So that continuum of energy, according to both the Dogen tradition and a number of references, self-divides into 14 domains, the same way that deep sea water self-differentiates into biological zones, where the kind of life you have living on the bottom of the ocean is very different than the kind of life that enjoys the surface. And all the way down in the domains of water, you have different kinds of life depending on how much sunlight do they like, what water temperature do they like, what water pressure do they prefer, things like that. So there's a self-differentiation that happens in this continuum of energy. It defines 14 domains of energy that coincide with Hinduism's domains of consciousness. And so this term Reina actually refers to the most primordial level of those domains of energy. The same energies that produce matter also produce consciousness, according to the Dogen. And so as these domains of energy emerge, we're producing levels of consciousness that are treated as conscious beings in the same way we are. So Reina, they all have a proper name, and Reina is the proper name for that primordial domain of energy. The second word down below, the second Egyptian word that I haven't talked about yet, constitutes what I call a defining word. In the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, there are certain words whose purpose is to assign a meaning to an unpronounced trailing glyph. That's how the glyphs receive their designations of what they represent. And once we realize that, we can lay out a whole passel of Egyptian glyphs, hundreds of them, literally hundreds of them, where on the authority of the Egyptian language itself, I can state what the glyph represents. And oftentimes they represent more than one thing, because these energies operate on different scales, and the same symbol represents the same energy on all those different scales. So the bottom word says, the glyphs read, the continuum of two energies materialize as they materialize. And it assigns essentially what's essentially a personal icon to Reina. The word is pronounced Ren, R-E-N or R-E-N-N, but properly it's Reina. And the trailing glyph becomes the icon of Reina. It's the image of a birth mother and her newborn infant first regarding each other. At the moment they first regard each other, it's as benign an image as anyone could possibly ask for to associate with that primordial consciousness. The consciousness is not deified. The consciousness is treated like any other consciousness. It's just an energetic form of consciousness. Now, over the course of the system, we're given maybe half a dozen different glimpses of who Reina is. And every one of those glimpses is every bit as benign as this image suggests. For example, Raynaud sends out orbs of plasma as messengers between the domains of consciousness, including the human domain of consciousness, of individualized consciousness. Those are called, the Egyptians called them Aku orbs. The Dogon called them Ogo. 5,000 years later, they're referring, or 9,000 years later, thousands of years later, their word Aku has morphed into the word Ogo. The Dogon have three classes of Ogo or Aku orbs. And the collective name for those three classes is Tityani, Tityaynie, Tityani. That word literally means to send to say hello. This is another one of the glimpses we get of who Raynaud is. Her messengers are called to send to say hello. These are the energetic orbs we've been witnessing in the skies above New Jersey, above Scandinavia, recently above Moscow. They aggregate around nuclear sites. They dog nuclear task groups. They are present at times of nuclear tensions. The reason for that, I think, is because when we explode a nuclear bomb, we don't do damage just to our domain of energy. We do it to all the domains. And the other consciousnesses can't tolerate that. And so somewhere along the line, around 1940, the story we saw in Day the Earth Stood Still of the Earth being precluded from using nuclear weaponry probably actually happened. And this was probably the group behind it. We have been precluded from using those weapons. Last month, you saw a B-52, quite arguably on a nuclear mission to Iran, take off from an airport at Edwards Air Force Base and end up as a smear on the tarmac. Not because the Aku orbs that were in the region brought it down, but because that B-52 was equipped with radar that was capable of emitting an electromagnetic pulse. And in the laboratory, that pulse will destroy an energetic orb, a plasma orb. But in real life, the plasma orb absorbs the energy and reflects some of it back at the sender. The B-52 was protected from an electromagnetic pulse that comes from the outside, but it was not protected from an electromagnetic pulse that originated inside itself. And so they accidentally fried all their own avionics and disabled all 8 of their engines at one time, and also disabled their flaps so they couldn't glide, which the plane should be able to do. And they ended up as a smear on the tarmac because of their own stupid, aggressive action. So now, to the point of the presentation. We at last get to it after that setup. In around 3600 BC, about the beginning of the Hebrew calendar, midway through what the people in India will call the Yuga half cycle. It's a 12,000 year half cycle starting at about 12,000 BC. About halfway through that, or around 9,000 BC, starting about halfway through that cycle to where we are now, a group of energetic consciousnesses, according to the Dogon, were able to take material form. We're familiar with this idea because that's what's related to us in the Old Testament when we talk about the burning bush and Moses. The burning bush is a plasma orb. So these plasma orbs, which were one class of the Aku orbs, were able to take material form. The reason they could do that was because we have scrolling energy between two domains that work like an hourglass. Energy is moving from one domain to the other one like sand in an hourglass. And that energy creates differences in the pace of time between the two domains. At the midpoint in the cycle, the amount of sand in the top hourglass is equal to the amount of sand in the bottom hourglass. And now the time frames equalize, and it becomes possible or thinkable to move across from one domain to the other one, the same way that we move out of a submarine into a different water pressure because we've gone through a pressure chamber before we do that. Same thing in space. So the Dogon are saying midpoint of the cycle, these energetic consciousnesses came through, took material form, and started interacting with humanity. But it wasn't safe for us to be around them for a very long period of time. So they enlisted a group of adjunct teachers who had originally been taught around 9000 BC in the era of Göbekli Tepe and had done the best job of retaining all the details of their knowledge. Those were the Africans like the Dogon. And so the Dogon became the adjunct teachers on this place that I'm about to talk to, called the Orkney Islands. In the left-hand picture, you see the Orkney Islands up at the tip of Scotland. They're just off the tip of Scotland. In the right-hand picture, you see a magnification of what those islands look like. And what we're concerned with here are primarily two islands. The mainland, which is the big island in the center that's labeled mainland, where Kirkwall is. And just below that to the left is the island of Hoy. This is another view of what those islands look like. Again, the mainland's in the center. Hoy is down just below it. Now, from the mainland, from a little isthmus of land called Stennis, everything that is there is set against the backdrop of the mountains of Hoy. You can see Hoy directly from the spot. It really becomes a literal theatrical backdrop. So subliminal that the first time that Isaac and I visited there, I scarcely noticed that the mountains were there because I was more interested. This picture is taken, the object in front is called the Maze Howe Chamber Cairn. It looks like Klaatu's spaceship. It's a resonant mound. And it sets in direct view of the two mountains of Hoy. Now, Orkney is important because the geography of Orkney does some very interesting things. The first thing it does is, back in this previous picture, we saw where Maze Howe was situated. From that spot, or near that spot, two motions of the sun can be observed. The first one is a linear motion of sunrise to sunset that happens every day, and the sun sets behind the mountains of Hoy. That's the longitudinal wave of Alphen waves, and it's energetic. The second motion, if you watch every day, are the seasonal progressions of that sunset northward and southward between the solstices and the equinox. This particular photo is the equinox sunset from that spot where the sun sets squarely between the two mountains. That's the form of the ancient Egyptian Akhet. The dynamic of sunrise to sunset produces the same almond-shaped graph that the Alphen waves produce. So in other words, somebody in ancient times picked this spot as a site of instruction. The Dogon say that global instruction took place here. What happened was that the group of teachers who were here would go out and select 8 tribes people from a given tribal group, transport them here to a remote location, instruct them in a civilizing plan for humanity and in skills like agriculture and other basic skills, construction skills and things like that, tagged to a symbolic cosmology whose only focus was on these primordial energies. That's the only thing that's ever talked about in the ancient symbolism, is the creational energies and how they work. So from this spot on Orkney, we had visibility on a human scale of the two dynamics of the Alphen waves. Now, just across the water from those mountains, further west than where we are sitting here on Orkney, is a tall hill called Wideford Hill. And on Wideford Hill has a clear view of the Hoy Mountains, among other things, has a panoramic view of the island. From that vantage point, the two mountains of Hoy replicate the wavelengths of the Alphen waves, which I pictured at the far left. This chambered cairn that sits on top of that hill is called the Wideford Cairn, and it is configured just like a scientific technique that's pictured below called particle sounding. Because the alpha waves are too small for us to measure directly, we can only figure out what their wavelengths are indirectly. And the way we do that is when particles move around the magnetic field around those alpha waves, they produce orbits that are much larger than the way alpha waves are, and we can measure those orbits. And so if you have 3 of those orbits, you can infer from the 3, you can triangulate on those the way that a cannon firing triangulates on, it fires two range shots and then it fires squarely in between the 2 and it hits its target. Well, that's sort of the way this works, is the 3 measures allow science to accurately estimate what the wavelength of the alpha waves are. So now, between the Hoy Mountains and the Wideford Cairn, we have all of the critical dynamics of the alpha waves replicated for us as if it were a tutorial. And we've been handed a way to measure the wavelength of the alpha waves. Somebody was doing a terrific job of representing the science in a way that would last. Now, on the left of this picture, we have a drawing of what the dynamics of what's called how the alpha waves are distributed. They're distributed from through a process called an alphenic cascade. What's pictured at the left is an alphenic cascade whose dynamic is to shift energy from larger scales to smaller scales. It begins wide open at the top with the magnetosphere, and it moves. The arrows show us what direction the waves are moving. In the middle, you see that we have an oscillating standing wave created. This is an illustration of the dynamic of how that alphenic cascade works. This is how the waves that we were just shown the dynamics of get distributed out in the world. There's also something called an inverse alphenic cascade, and that's the opposite. It moves in the opposite direction, and it moves energy from smaller scales to larger scale. Now, it just so happens on Orkney, we have, just across the water from those Hoy Mountains, an isthmus of land that culminates at Stennes. And what that isthmus of land allows us to do is replicate this dynamic of the alphenic cascade. It begins up at the Bay of Scale, up at the top, and it continues down to the standing stones of Stennis and the Maeshowe Chamber Cairn down at the bottom. And you can see that the isthmus forms a kind of a pointing fingered hand. This is probably the root of the concept of a cubit. And that finger points in the direction of flow of the energy. Now, we know that's what's trying to be represented because, okay, the situation is we have all sorts of different groups from all over the world who were educated in the same place by the same teachers. Now, if you and I happen to meet at a cocktail party and we realize that back in high school in different eras, we'd had the same math teacher, we might realize that we both know the same story problems and use all the same esoteric terms to describe concepts. You know, if our math teacher had jokingly called the division sign a widget, we might both call the division sign a widget. Not because I got it from you or you got it from me, but because we had the same teacher. So the way the ancient languages work is they all have the same words and terminologies and concepts because they were all taught by the same teachers and they were taught the same system by the same teachers. So I can go to an Egyptian hieroglyphic language if I don't understand what a term means, and I can sort out what the term must mean because the glyphs of the word spell it out for me. So the word sten, as in Stennes on Orkney, exists in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language. And what the glyphs say is, reading from left to right, okay, the word means journey or to retreat, which is the description of the cascade and the inverse cascade. The glyphs read, the descent of magnetic energy in steps. once we know what the glyphs represent, it's easy to produce this little sentence the same way a child solves a rebus puzzle. You substitute the word eye for a picture of an eye, and you solve the puzzle. That's exactly how these words are solved. None of the Egyptologists know this or recognize it. It's same is true in ancient Chinese hieroglyphs. We have eye-to-eye comparability between certain words in the original form of the Chinese hieroglyphs and the Egyptian hieroglyphs, which means that when those cultures say they were given their written languages by somebody, that's probably true because their both systems are formulated exactly the same way. So Stennes refers to the idea of the journey of magnetic energy in steps. And that's exactly what it spells out for us. And I'm now going to explain to you how that works. It begins with the Bay of Scale. The Bay of Scale takes the same shape as how science diagrams what's called non-magnetic flow of plasma. Non-magnetic flow of plasma can expand into space in an unrestricted way, an unresisted way. So this is sort of the open-ended beginning of that cascade that I had pictured on the previous slide back here, the open end at the top there, top left. So scale literally means it combines a cosmological term Sakai, which means to celebrate, and the word El, which is the name of the Canaanite god of space. So Sakai El literally means celebrate space. That's exactly what non-magnetic flow of plasma does. It celebrates space because it can move right into it as far as it wants. It's the way you stretch out on a bed when you come home after a hard day. You celebrate space. Now, the next structure that comes, let's go back to this, starting at the Bay of Scale in the map in the center. Just south of that is the Scarabray village, which is considered to be the first farming village. But in fact, it looks to me like dorm housing for the 8 initiates and their families. So the Scarabray village looks like the picture from the air is configured like this image from the air. And it compares to the next stage of the Alphenna cascade, which is called MHD turbulence. MHD stands for magnetohydrodynamics. It's a fancy term for plasma liquid, the dynamics of plasma liquid. So MHD turbulence is described by science as the act of energy carving into hills. The word Scarabray in the Faroese language literally means carved into hills. And the chambers of the Scarabray village were literally carved into hills of midden that had been placed there for the building of the houses. So at each of these stages, we have multiple levels of confirmation that this is exactly what they're talking about. There's no skeptic is going to come along and say, oh, you're imagining this. They confirmed it 2 or 3 to half a dozen different ways, depending on what stage we're at. We cannot mistake what they're talking about. They're talking about plasma physics. And the way we know they're talking about plasma physics is because the Dogon are clearly talking about plasma physics, and so are the Egyptians. It's plasma physics. Even though the knee-jerk impulse is, oh, somebody in that era could not possibly have been talking about it. Nobody alive had the overview to talk about plasma physics. Clearly, somebody did. And not only did they have the perspective, they understood the physics thoroughly, just like John West expected. So the next structure that comes down that isthmus is the Ring of Buchan. It corresponds to a spatial diagram of the critical balance surface, where that same magnetohydrodynamic energy fracture into what are called field-aligned packets. So I pictured the scientific representation of that on the side, on the right-hand side, and the shape of the Ring of Buchan on the left-hand side. The scientific description is that energy forms little ridges, raised ridges, as packets. The next stage of the isthmus is the Buchan chambered cairn, which I have less explicit confirmation of right where it sits, but the next sequential stage of the cascade is the formation of large-scale alpha wave structures on the right, and we can see there's surely a resemblance between the two. Now, further on down the cascade, there's another place. Well, I'll get to this in a second. The next stage of the cascade down the isthmus is a place called the Ness of Brodgar that's considered to be a civic ceremonial center. That corresponds to a state of weak alphenic turbulence. And this is a domain where magnetic islands form. We can see the resemblance to the actual magnetic island and the structures they've excavated at the Ness of Brodgar. There's definitely resemblance. But if we're in doubt, further down the chain in the magnetic or the alphenic cascade, there's a place where magnetic islands form again, and someone did a better job of representing what they meant there. It's called the Unstand cairn. The Unstand cairn looks like the figure on left, and just like a magnetic island, it forms 4 magnetic segments or chambers in the top half of it, and a 5th chamber at the bottom that represents a kind of a piston, an energetic piston whose function is to increase pressure on the rest of the magnetism. We can see by the configuration of the Unstand cairn that somebody got that exactly right. On the bottom right, I show you what that dynamic of the piston is scientifically, and it's just what was produced in the Unstand cairn. Now, the word Unstand comes from a root word, onsta, that meant dwelling. The second picture from the left on the screen is a diagram of one of the early forms of dwellings on Orkney. And you can see it takes the same shape as the Unstand cairn. So dwelling is exactly the right name to have given this. Okay, back up where we came from at the Ness of Brodgar as we're coming down the isthmus. The ancient name for the Ness of Brodgar was Haberdsteiger, which means horse's field. Orkney, one of the names for Orkney, the early names for Orkney was Horse Island. Now, the reason that this is called horse's field energetically is because what's happening energetically in this domain of energy is that energy is transitioning through different phases in ways that science compares to a horse's gait. It's shifting from a walk to a trot to a canter to a gallop. So calling this Haberdsteiger makes sense. Now, as we continue to move down that isthmus of land, the next thing we come to is called the Barnhouse Village and the Barnhouse structure. This corresponds to a state of strong alphenic turbulence. It's a place where vortexes of energy form, whose purpose is to transfer energy from large scales down to smaller scales. The structure that corresponds to this on Orkney, the Barnhouse structure, I've interpreted, having visited several times, as an ancient schoolroom. As a matter of fact, in Hinduism, in all these traditions we're educated here, there's a strong nostalgia where the culture feels they have to create honorific structures of the place where they were educated, the same way you might feel nostalgia for your college. At Abydos, we have a half a dozen of those. The Buddhists built a school shaped very much like this at a place called Vulture Peak, where, according to myth, was where the Buddha was first gave his teachings after he was enlightened, at the top of this peak. That structure, the Barnhouse structure, takes a very similar shape to how the center picture, which is how science diagrams the alphenic vortex. The right-hand figure is an artist's rendition of what the vortex actually looks like. And the dynamics of that vortex are a match for the dynamics of a black hole. I did some research and discovered that the energetic steps between the dynamics of a black hole, the black hole at the center of our galaxy, and the dynamics of energy of our planetary system are the same as the dynamics between this alphenic vortex and the previous stage of weak alphenic turbulence. In other words, our existence persists in the dynamic of an inverse alphenic cascade. The next stage of energy that persists down that isthmus is called the watchstone. This is the point, if you look at the left-hand picture, the point from which it's a constant point from which a person could observe the sun's seasonal motions behind the mountains of Hawaii, which are in the background. It was called the watchstone. It sits at the entryway to the Nessa Brodgar Civic Center. The Dogan build, they erect a pillar, just a stone pillar, just like this one. I have pictures of them side by side. They look exactly like. They erect it in the courtyard on the way coming into their villages, and it acts like a sundial. It's a town clock. But in terms of the alphenic energy, it corresponds to what's called an alphenic velocity spike. I pictured that to the far right, and I've given you another picture of the watchstone so you can see what it looks like from a different angle. Now, in terms of the energetics, the alphenic spike also identifies points of conversion of energy. The alphenic spike is a tool they use to measure the alphenic disk, the descent of the alphenic cascade, because it's large enough and bright enough for them to measure. And so it serves the same function that the watchstone serves. It's the point of measure. Now you can see behind the central picture of the watchstone are with what remains of the standing stones of Stennis. So the watchstones sit, and I'll explain to you what those are about, and you'll see that it involves a significant transition in the energetics, and the watchstone marks that the same way that the velocity spike marks it in the energy. So the next stage that we come to are the standing stones of Stennis. In Neolithic times, the picture on the right shows you what they look like. There were 12 stones placed in sockets surrounded by a low ditch that was horseshoe shaped that opened to the north. It represents a circumstance that's called alphenic resonance. Now, if we were to essentially anthropomorphize those energetics, what we would produce is what's called a magnetron. A magnetron is a device whose purpose is to focus energy, a beam of energy, in a particular direction. So we know from the start that the configuration of the standing stones of Stennis might have had that ability. They mimic the domain of alphenic resonance that exists on the Earth, which I pictured to the right, which also forms as a horseshoe shape opening to the north. So again, we have a couple of levels of confirmation that this is what they're talking about. The next structure that inline down that isthmus, the one that we saw before that looked like Klaatu's spaceship, is the Maes-Howe chambered cairn. And the more familiar we become with the Maes-Howe chambered cairn, the more we realize that it resembles an ion cyclotron. Now, when we're dealing with ancient symbolism, a lot of times things resemble other things that they might not actually be. There's a function going on here that the human brain is wired for. It's called pareidolia. The brain is wired to create sense out of things that might not be sensible, to create patterns out of things that might not really have the patterns. So when we look at the Maes-Howe chamber cairn and we say, gee, this looks like an ion cyclotron, we have to allow that that's maybe our imagination. That may be more our imagination than what actually is real. But we do have to ask the question. I was taught as a student in science that the job of the scientist is, when you have competing answers for a question, the scientist's job is to sincerely entertain each of those questions, to start with the assumptions of the answer and follow wherever those assumptions lead you. And eventually you'll bump into an answer where all of the obstacles evaporate, and then you know that's the right answer to the question you're looking at. So my instinct was, knowing that this might resemble a cyclotron, is to ask, is it possible it was? And if it was, how could it possibly have worked? Well, the way it worked is a little bit complicated, but it's absolutely worth hearing. This is a picture of that entire isthmus. The isthmus comes down past the Ring of Brooklyn to the Brooklyn Cairn, past what next should be the Ness of Brodgar, past something we haven't talked about yet, which is the Ring of Brodgar, which has a purpose and a part in this cycle, past the Watchstone, past the Barnhouse Village, past the Stones of Stennis, to the Maze Howe Chamber Cairn. The Stones of Stennis, down towards the bottom, are iron-rich sandstone, which is highly magnetic and highly conductive, set into a bed of clay that is iron-rich clay, which is also highly conductive. That little spot where the sits between two bodies of water. In Neolithic times, around 3200 BC, the loch of Stennis was highly salinated, meaning very salty. The loch of Hare was fresh water. If you know anything about energetics, you realize that sets up a flow of electrical current. When you move from a very salty domain to a very fresh water domain, you create a current of electricity. The standing stones, which sat on that spot, were configured like a magnetron, which is a kind of a battery, to not only to absorb and store that energy, but also to focus in a certain direction. So that created a natural battery that I've known for a long time existed. I just had no idea why it existed. What were they doing with that battery? Here's an aerial overview of the Isthmus of Land and the standing stones of Stennis where they sit. As part of those standing stones, are these stones set in the direction of Maze Howe that precisely target the Maze Howe Chamber Cairn. They were beaming electrical energy at the Maze Howe Chamber Cairn. When it got to the Maze Howe Chamber Cairn, there was a henge ditch that was likely filled with water, and even more likely filled with salt water, because salt water is very conductive. And if you have a ditch like that around an ion cyclotron, the dynamics of the ditch will serve to feed the beam of energy into the cyclotron down the long shaft entryway of the Maze Howe Cairn. Now, even if this was constructed in the right way, which it looks like it is, to be a cyclotron, there's another factor you need to be able to make the cyclotron work. You need a static magnetic field. And so the question is, how were they producing a static magnetic field? Well, they built the cairn out of large slabs of old Orkney red sandstone, which itself is very conductive, but it also happens to include some component elements that are absolutely essential to creating a static magnetic wave. It includes quartz pieces, and it includes hematite. Now, the combination of those things inside of what it was constructed as a highly resonant chamber was tuned to the sound, the frequency of a male baritone voice or the sound of a beating drum. And so people would come into the Maze Howe Chamber Cairn, they would chant, or they would beat drums repeatedly. There's another indication that they might have used lyres, strung lyres, and that those tones evoked the static magnetic field you need to make a cyclotron work. So now we have started the cyclotron. Essentially, the way they started it was by chanting. Here is an overview of what the structure of the Mays-Howe cairn is on the left, with two views of it like an architectural drawing. On the right is the innermost chamber of the Mays-Howe cairn. So the beam of energy would come down that long chamber into the main chamber. In the main chamber, you find 4 standing stones, very much almost identical to the standing stones we saw, the standing stones of Stennis. At the standing stones of Stennis, they worked like electrodes. They also worked like electrodes here. These are not load-bearing. These are set up against the walls in these spots. There are 4 of them. There's one behind the camera we can't see. So the energy would come into the chamber. It would spin in the side chambers, perpendicular to the floor. And then these 4 electrodes would refocus that energy into a beam, a vertical beam, perpendicular to the spinning energy that would beam upward out of what was then considered to be the open ceiling of the chamber cairn. So with all of that, we have all the elements we need to actually create a 2-way energetic link to the ionosphere. Now, in most parts of the planet, that's not a possible thing because the atmosphere interferes with doing that. There happen to be 2 points on the Earth, 2 specific points on the Earth, where because there are persistent high winds, the atmosphere doesn't interfere in the same way. One of those is Orkney, and the other one is Shetland, an island north of Orkney. So what we've seemingly produced is a 2-way link, energy link, to energies in the ionosphere, actually specifically to what's called the ionosphere wind dynamo. That's the domain of energy that Tesla was trying to link to. He knew there was an inexhaustible supply of energy up there. If he could tap into that, he would have an inexhaustible supply of energy to use down here on Earth. And if he could create a two-way link, he'd have it being fed down to him, not just linking to it. So the skeptic's going to say, all of this is well and good. You have all these things that look to you like they created dynamo. It's not thinkable that anybody actually did it. What actual proof do we have that anybody could have done this or that they actually did do it? Because if we don't have that, we don't have anything. As it turns out, there are 5 actual proofs that they actually did it. Okay, the first one arises because the downward flow of plasma from that link naturally distributes itself over the surface of the Earth in a particular way. It distributes the way the left-hand image shows as what I call skewed vectors of energy. And those skewed vectors take the same shape as what you see in the middle picture, which are the ley lines of energy in England, which are only theoretical because nobody in the world has a way of credibly suggesting they were fed with energy. Guess what? Now we do. So we've now, besides the other things that we've confirmed are probably true, we've confirmed the likelihood that the ley lines were actual things too, that the people didn't just incidentally set all of their resonance structures along straight line paths. They did it because they would intersect with these plasma energies that were coming down from Mays-Howe, which happened to sit right up at the northern terminus of the ley lines. So it looks as if at 3200 BC, Mays-Howe was feeding plasma energy into the ley lines. You ask yourself, what possible motive would somebody have for those plasma energies? Well, the truth is that a plasma orb, which is what we understand these teachers to have originally been, have the same kind of a need for constant renewal in plasma energy that we have for 8 hours of sleep a night. So distributing the energy down into the lower UK meant that the plasma-based teachers were no longer limited to Orkney. They could now move southward. On the far right are pictures of some of the sites in the lower UK that sit along these ley lines. The second proof we have that the link was actually made comes out of a second structure that I had never heard mentioned. No one had ever talked about it. I didn't know it existed. It's called the overbigging enclosure. It sits a few hundred yards north of where the Mays Howe Cairn is. And it gives the impression of a quasi-geological inverse image of the Mays Howe Chamber Cairn. It can only be seen from the air. Over the centuries, farmers have plowed over the top of this, and so there's not nearly as much there now as there originally was. It's barely visible anymore, but it's there. It turns out that if you have a two-way plasma link to that ionosphere domain, that dynamo I was talking about, and it gets catastrophically interrupted, the discharge of plasma energy that is fed downward has the ability to produce one of these ground images. It's a selfie. And what it's a selfie of is the originating source of the upward energy. And so what was produced was a selfie image of the Mays Howe Cairn. We have objective proof that there was a link from the Mays Howe Cairn. And when I say it's an inverse image, I literally mean inverse. You have the image flipped, sort of top and bottom, but you also have every above ground feature of the Mays Howe Cairn indented in ground in the overbigging enclosure image. So it's literally an inverse image. That's exactly what the plasma energy can do. There is no credible process I know of beyond that could do it, and no motive for a person to do it. The third evidence we have that there was a plasma link arises because of the dynamics of the link itself. When there is a catastrophic disruption of a link like that, they've tested this in laboratory settings, the downward discharge of energy that's produced is discharged at a vertical angle of 0.5 degrees. When we measure the distance in yards between the Mays Howe Chambered Cairn and the overbigging structure enclosure, and the distance up to the ionosphere, it produces a vertical angle of 0.5 degrees. So the placement of the image is absolutely right for the disruption of that kind of a link. So the link existed. The last proof we have of it, or no, the next to the last proof is that discharge of energy that comes down is extremely hot. It's so hot that when it impacts the ground, it melts the minerals that are in the ground below it, and it distributes those melted minerals outward radially from the center of the image beyond the edge of the image. And when those minerals cool, they produce what are called igneous intrusions. And we have those igneous intrusions around the overbigging enclosure. So they testify again, that's exactly how this was produced. The last of the objective proofs that we have of that kind of a link is that kind of plasma discharge has another possible side effect. It's capable of desalinating a body of water. And at the same moment in time that this discharge happened, is indicated to have happened, suddenly the loch of Stennis becomes markedly desalinated. It's now no longer the salty body of water that it was. So with the desalinization of that body of water, the flow of oscillating energy to the stone circle at the standing stones was shut off, which means it disabled the cyclotron. The cyclotron was no longer able to be worked. And so people started packing up on Orkney and they started leaving in an orderly way. They took their time about it. They didn't want to leave their livestock, so they had a final feast where they killed 700 animals. And they left symbolic elements all over the side of the feast that imply that they left under duress. They had to leave. But not such duress that they had to leave quickly. They could take their time about it. Okay. When we ask ourselves what possibly could have caused that cataclysmic disruption of the plasma link, there is a very narrow range of astronomical circumstances that can produce that without first destroying the atmospheric dynamo, which it didn't do, and without affecting the rotational rate of the Earth, which it also didn't do. And what that pinpoints is the close flyby of a planet-sized body, which happens to be what Immanuel Velikovsky claimed happened with Mars and Venus on recurring bases, that both planets made recurring close passes of the Earth in ancient times and created havoc. He inferred this working with primary textual sources from ancient cultures that he had access to at Columbia University. And he, since writing about it in his book, Worlds in Collision, he has been literally laughed out of the scientific community as the crackpot's crackpot, to the point that any astronomer who wants a career can't even mention the name Velikovsky, even when the theory he's proposing objectively upholds what Velikovsky says. It's to the point where the viewpoint of the exosolar system astronomers aligns specifically with exactly what Velikovsky claimed for the birth of Venus, and yet they won't say his name. When I was writing my book, the Velikovsky Heresies, I had the assistance of Berkeley's head of their search for Earth-like planets, and he confirmed that the consensus view of the exoplanet scientists is, he didn't put it in terms of Velikovsky's name, but the way he explained it is it's exactly Velikovsky's scenario. So what we had was the close flyby of a planet at 2600 BC. That same close flyby, back in the days when this image on the ground was a lot more visible than it is now, the suggestion is that it took the shape of a hand. It resembled a hand inside of a circle, the Hamsa symbol belongs to many different cultures. The Hamsa, according to sources I checked online, is deeply intertwined with the concept of radiating, blocking, and discharging energy. There are more than half a dozen different cultures that preserve that Hamsa sign as a protective symbol, a personal protective symbol. They all associated it with Venus. And so my inference is that the planet that made its close approach by us at 2600 BC was Venus. It's associated with Ishtar. Ishtar's symbolism is to Venus. Ishtar had reputation of intermittently performing destructive acts against humanity. Now, after the cyclotron was shut down on Orkney in about the same era, it looks like they tried to replace the flow of oscillating electricity to it. And the way they did that was they built the Ring of Brodgar, which this is the same configuration as the first stone placements at Stonehenge. There are half a dozen different indications at Stonehenge that somebody from Orkney was enlisted to be the architect of Stonehenge. Only when they built this Ring of Brodgar, they improved the technology over what they had at Maes Howe. Here they used a technique called large-scale electromagnetic excitation. Part of the reason they used it was because it's not subject to the same bad effects if there's an interruption of the two-way exchange of energy. This sits further north on the isthmus than Maes Howe is, but it's the same vicinity. Now, the skeptic will ask, how can you possibly insist that this was ever actually used to link to the ionosphere? Well, again, we have ways of demonstrating that. Okay. In addition to the Ring of Brodgar, which you can see in the distance, they also created an improved magnetron. This magnetron functioned on the basis of one standing stone, and in the context of two other stub stones that were set perpendicularly to it, they created a magnetron that could feed the energy coming off of the Ring of Brodgar in the direction of Maes Howe. Whether they fed it first to the Ring of Brodgar or whether they passed the Ring of Brodgar, I can't say for sure yet. Now, the way that we know that this was actually used is because, again, a highly disputed historical event. In 1760, okay, that Ring of Brodgar was built at 2600 BC. almost 4,000 years later, at 1760, a poet, an Irish poet by the name of James McPherson, published what he claimed were translations of lost Gaelic texts. He published them. They were called the Poems of Ossian. And they were set at, the storyline of the poems was set at the Circle of Luda, which he freely admitted was the Ring of Brodgar. In the center, we have a picture of the Circle of Loda. And on the left, we have a map along the isthmus of where the Circle of Loda was represented to be. Same place as the Ring of Brodgar. We recognize the site. Now, McPherson, for his own reasons, would not produce the original text, and the suspicion is it's because he stole them. And he didn't want to confess to having stolen them. But in those poems, he cites certain side effects that occur at the Circle of Loda that are very esoteric. These are so discrete from one another that no one in their right mind would associate them together. The first one is he described the formation of a large dark cloud. Next, he described the hearing of a very eerie, low whistling sound. The third thing is he described the appearance at night of ground effects that look like fire, could be mistaken for fires. We also have an Orkney legend that imagines the stones of the Ring of Brodgar to have been dancers who were dancing to the tune of a fiddle. All four of those effects are effects that objectively associate with the excitation energy that I just said was evoked by the Ring of Brodgar. So those effects weren't documented scientifically for another 150 years after McPherson wrote. So it looks as if somebody in ancient times witnessed them at the Ring of Brodgar. Now, another complaint that was raised against McPherson is one of his Orkney academics said, you know, the word Loda has never been spoken in these islands. That's a made-up word. We don't know it. It doesn't exist here. You're not, what you translated, you made up. It's not real. But it turns out the word Loda does exist there. It's part of the Faroese lexicon. A word only enters the lexicon if it's in common usage. It means load or charge in the sense of charging a battery, so electrical charge. There were also in that era, in the Viking era, there was a system of canals on Orkney that allowed the Viking ships to skip all of the turbulent waters around Orkney. They would pass through and they'd take a shortcut through Orkney instead of around it. The Viking earls who came up with that plan to build those types of canals were called the Earls of Loda. At that same moment on Orkney, there was a classic class of horizontal watermill that came out of the Vikings region. These were Norse watermills that Orkney was famous for, and they were called lodas. And I pictured one of them on the far right. You notice that the actual wheel of the Loda watermill takes the same configuration as the Circle of Loda. In other words, it again looks as if McPherson actually translated something real, and that all the academics did to McPherson what they did to Emanuel Velikovsky. They didn't like what he said, and so they poo-pooed it. And they drummed him out of the academic corps because they couldn't tolerate what he was saying was true. So in the perspective I'm presenting to you, we now, in addition to rehabilitating Velikovsky and other, the ley lines in the UK, we're also rehabilitating James McPherson. So we understand that the formation of those inverse images is a signature of a link to the ionosphere. So the question now is, are there any other spots on the planets where they had a similar link to the ionosphere? It turns out there are. I've now identified spots on 4 different continents where they were doing that, including North America. Now, if you go south into the UK, there's a place called Dorset. And Dorset had a resonant chamber where they used to chant and drum. And outwardly, it took the form of what's called a waveguide. I pictured that, a scientific waveguide in the middle. You can see the immediate resemblance to the Long Barrow Mound at Dorset. A waveguide doesn't have the ability all by itself to link to the ionosphere. But if you combine it with a resonant chamber, which is what's inside of that mound, you do have the ability under the right circumstances. And so the way you got it started again was with chanting and with drumming. You evoke the magnetic field, you link that with electrical energy that was created by the rising and falling waters in the chalk bed that the Long Barrow sits on. And you had the right elements to create a link to the atmosphere. But what you also have at Dorset, close by, set at a 0.5 degree vertical angle from the mound, is something called the Dorset Circus. That is described by some scientists as an inverse image of the Long Barrow. So it looks as if the Long Barrow, the Long Barrow Circus, or the Dorset Circus, was created around 3300 BC. The Long Barrow at Dorset was created around 3800 BC. So it looks like the Long Barrow at Dorset was operating from 3800 BC forward. And at 3300 BC, we had another close pass of a planet, as Velikovsky insists happened many times, disrupted the ionosphere, created the discharge, recorded the selfie image in the ground of the circus. And now suddenly the Long Barrow was no longer functional as an interlink to those energies, so they had to replace it. The way they replaced it was they built Mays Howe, and when they built it, they improved the technology. The ion cyclotron is far better technology than the Long Barrow was. These maps show us that Dorset is situated right at the southern tip of England, and it sits right on the confluence of several of the ley lines, in the same way that Mays Howe is situated right at the northern terminus of those ley lines. So it's very thinkable that originally the energy was being fed in by Dorset, and at 3000 BC or 2600 BC, suddenly it was being fed from Mays Howe. Here's another of the sites. This is called the Serpent Mound Disruption. It exists in Ohio. It's set nearby at a 0.5 degree angle from the Adena mounds that are nearby. It's described by scientists as an inverse image of one of the Adena mounds. The Adena mounds were resonant chambers. Here's another one of the resonant mounds. It's called Silbury Hill. It's older. It's more recent. It dates from closer to 2400 BC. And it looks like what existed at Silbury Hill was a man-made mound that, like a lot of other mounds in the UK, was covered with specific materials that were highly resonant. And so they may have achieved a link to the energies in the ionosphere using a man-made mound and a resonant chamber inside of it. But at 2400 BC, there was another catastrophic burst of energy. Only this time the link wasn't to the ionosphere dynamo. It was to something called the Birkeland currents, which is what I said relate to the seat of Amma. When you have a link to the Birkeland currents, there's a discharge of energy, but it isn't emitted at a 0.5 degree angle. It's emitted straight directly downward. And it has the capacity not only to carve a ditch in a bed of chalk, as was carved at that point in time around Silbury Hill. It also has the ability to reshape the mound into, it's not taking a selfie image of the ground structure that evoked the link, it's taking a selfie image of a dynamic of the energy above. So I pictured for you what the dynamic of the energy is above and the shape that Silbury Hill took after the carving, and they're the same. The plasma discharge in this case happens in the cascade in a series of events, and Silbury Hill was thought to have been built in a series of events, and the energy by some researchers' reports was laid down in a spiraling shape like the one on the right. Here's artwork that displays what Silbury Hill ostensibly looked like early on. So we have another example of the same thing in a later time period with a link to a different domain of energy. Looks like it was the same thing. We have other links at other places, more than I can actually document for you. We have one up in Scandinavia that looks like it was the same thing. It's a lot of work to try to track down and pin down all of the specific details that confirm it. But now what we need to begin with is just suspicion that it happened. And all of these confirm Velikovsky's view that two planets made recurring approaches to the Earth in those eras. If we move forward even further than that, we discover the Great Pyramid utilizes an energetic technique called the vertical peak acceleration. Now, we have an historical timeline going on here that starts at 38 BC and moves forward every couple of years to a different place. In the new place, we also have a technological timeline moving along where the technology gets improved at each step. This step is the logical improvement over the Ring of Brodgar. And so, to the likely dismay of lots of researchers, the implication is that the Great Pyramid was built at 2400 BC. On right is an illustration of what the dynamics of vertical peak acceleration are. This is the timeline. 3800 BC, Dorset is the source. 3300 BC, that gets disrupted. 3000 BC, Mays Howe becomes the ion cyclotron. 2600 BC, that gets disrupted. 2600 BC, the Ring of Brodgar gets built. 2400 BC, the Great Pyramid gets built. So John Anthony West was looking for objective confirmation of high technology in eras prior to the Great Pyramid. This is it. This is objective proof of it. Orkney Island is a complex, an island complex, an entire complex that serves as a life-scale tutorial on how these very energies work. And not only did it give us a tutorial, it gets to the end of the tutorial and it creates physical structures that execute them. So they're not just telling us how they work, they also show us how they work. So out of the 14 books I've written, the material I'm talking to you about belongs in a book that has not yet been published. It'll be called The Third Eye. I've been trying to finish it for more than a year because I thought I was done with it. But then a little occurrence happened. An interstellar visitor came into our planetary system and was paraded across the stage of our planetary system. And it utilizes, it's an objective example of all of the energetics I just talked to you about. And I had enough of an overview of what the energetics were because I just written about them to recognize them in that object. And I learned a great deal from the way that object moved, what it chose to do and didn't do, what its track was, how its energetics responded to things, and so on. That a whole other section of my book opened up that belonged in the book I had not yet published yet, but needed to be written and explored. And all of this, which I've only just finished up recently. I mean, I scheduled this talk right immediately on the heels of being certain what the dynamics were. These are the books where all of the groundwork for the dynamics are laid. 3 of my self-published books, which are recent in the last couple of years, and an earlier book, the Velikovsky Heresies, that was published by a subsidiary of Simon & Schuster called Inner Traditions. They were responsible for the bulk of my books. They did a terrific job on all of them. And my only real complaint working with them was it reached a point where I had time to self-publish a book in between submitting a manuscript to them and them actually getting around to publishing it. So after a while, it just became simpler and easier for me to control the process and self-publish the books. So that is the explanation. We'll return control back to our Zoom meeting. I'll try to end sharing here.
And so at this time, anyone have any questions, any comments, thoughts? Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask away.
And I'll try to answer. If I can get myself on the screen, I'll die happy.
I see Blake has a question.
Hey,
I
yeah,
canceled my link here. I got to link to you again.
You're still on, Laird.
Hey, I can't see me, but you can?
Yes.
Can you see me? Okay, good. Well, that's good. I don't need to see myself. So Blake has a question. What's Blake's question?
So, yeah, this is just, mind-blowing type stuff. And it really, to quote our pal Terence McKenna, reality is not only stranger than we suppose, it's stranger than we are capable of supposing. But it seems like you've kind of got a thread of a handle on the way, this map behind me that I kind of use as my Zoom background. This is a map of the world that was drawn fairly accurately, but when was the last time North America had a giant appendage sticking out into
Yes.
the Pacific Ocean from Oregon and Northern California? Well, it was 14,000 years ago,
Right,
before the
right,
ice age melted, right? And before the Younger Dryas
right.
and stuff. So huge Velichowski guy. But I always butcher his last name. But one of the things that, seeing this again with fresh eyes, Laird, your presentation really reminds me of a link between all the stuff Michael Tellinger talks about with those stone circles, a completely different type of energy than what us modern most advanced civilization presently uses, and are you familiar, how familiar are you with Michael Tellinger and all the Anunnaki stuff in Africa? And what they call them is they're all cattle calls, but there's millions of them, and the thing that brought them to light is Google Earth and drone technology. You can't see this stuff when you're standing in the middle of it, but when you're taking pictures above it, like a lot of the examples that you used in Scotland there, you can see these things from the air.
Right. I am familiar with Michael Tellinger and generally familiar with his work. The references he's making is sort of they're directly related to, but fall outside of what my path of learning was. So he's not a major source for me, but I respect what he does.
For sure. And how much credence? So my personal opinion about the birth of Venus, it's a myth that is a worldwide thing, just like the flood might have been caused by the flood. I don't know. I personally think that the flood was technology being used on the planet to change the way things actually work here. But
well, that might be because the energetic consciousnesses that are indicated to be behind the symbolic system and indicated to be behind the Dogon and the Egyptian symbolism, which is global, certainly would have the capability, if they got totally fed up with us and felt there was no hope for rehabilitating us, to initiate a change in the tilt of the axis of the Earth. And if you did that, you'd melt the ice caps and you'd flood the Earth. So it's thinkable that happened. I think this time around the cycle that they're hoping not to have to do that. Right. And one of the things that allows them not to have to do that is if we manage to sort this information out. In the mindset of Tibetan Buddhism, the purpose of hiding this energy, they state it very succinctly. They say, or the purpose of hiding this knowledge and of revealing it now, is to tame the beings of the end era. And they describe the end era in terms that are exactly what we're experiencing. They also say that the hope is that the revelation of this information will essentially shock humanity back into the proper way of looking at things. So my guess is they really don't want to be the originators of destruction. They really want us to help sort things out.
Right, right. And not to hog the mic, but what's your preface about the birth of Venus being actually Jupiter's a big mommy planet, and it every once in a while it spits out a core because that's the way it's kind of designed. It's, we've been kind of told by, the sciences that, oh, if Saturn were on a big enough ocean, it would float. And Jupiter, it's almost all atmosphere and there's no core. Well, every once in a while it spits out.
Well, Velikovsky's perspective that Venus was the consequence of a large planet striking Jupiter is actually the perspective of the exo-astronomers. They say that in these exosolar systems, the stars form in the first 10 million years after they form, the gas giant planets form. Right. In the next 10 million years, which is after the accretion disks have dissipated, the rocky planets form largely as a consequence of collisions.
Right.
So they've embraced Velikovsky's viewpoint. I took Velikovsky's perspective, his scenario, and tested it against 60 years of additional science and discovered that each stage of his scenario, it made sense. Right. That we had a handful of considerations that support him specifically. And so there may be more than one way that the rocky planets form. It looks to me like the more likely thing is what the exo astronomers say, which collisions are the main cause.
Well, from my perspective, and I'm sure, I don't know if I'm the only one who thinks this way, but the whole Shoemaker-Levy comet was kind of like, panspermia right into Jupiter. And then there might be a new baby moon planet getting ready to be popped out, whatever the gestation.
That could be.
You know what I mean?
That could be. I can't say that's not true, but whatever it is, by either of those techniques, there's no upper limit on when a planet can form. By the traditional views, planets stop forming after the accretion disk disappear. By Velikovsky's view, we could see a new planet form anytime if the right thing happens.
Right.
So yeah, feel free to chime in if anyone else has a question. You feel free to unmute yourself. I see Katie has a question.
Hey.
Okay.
Hi. Okay, so I have a quick question. I missed the last tail end of there. My internet popped up, so I don't know if you suggested it. But you were saying how these, having these plasma marks on the, effects on the ground was not affecting the atmosphere, and then thinking about the different astronomical properties like the Venus, is it possible that with that level of energy on the ground that it could have been some like form of a bomb or something, an energy bomb that would create that from, some uncomfortable...
It's thinkable, except that what I'm looking for are energetic effects that have the capability of producing that kind of an image in that kind of a spot. Okay, sitting 0.5 degrees from Mays Howe is a signature of a two-way link to the atmosphere. The two-way link can create a quasi-geometric selfie without melting it. A bomb would melt the image it tried to create.
Right, and I think I'm thinking of more of a higher technology bomb that would be more, not like our exploding type bombs, but I don't know, some departicleization type of bomb.
Right. Well, that's possible, but because we have all of the component elements to create the link, and we have them in progressive forms of progressing technology, it looks more to me like we're talking about the links, not warfare.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay.
Because we have a historical progression and we have a technological progression, both.
Right. That makes sense.
But
And no,
if, if we're
another
go
oh,
ahead.
well, another observation. You were talking about the French guy that got initiated into the Dogon and was the symbolism of the things that were surrounding them talking to each other looks a lot like the electrical discharge guy that
Yes.
is so
Yes.
famous in
Yeah.
regards to
Yeah. Yes.
the electric
Those
universe.
symbols that they were holding up there, the H-shaped symbols, they represent what happens with dimensionality. Okay, we recognize 3 linear dimensions. We also recognize a 4th dimension that's not linear. It's time. It's energetic. It's not linear. In the Dogon and the Egyptian system, what's indicated is that 3 descending energetic dimensions interface with 3 ascending linear dimensions. And so in proper form, that symbol takes the form of basically 2 Ys. But the same shape of the H is another way of representing it. And so for me, the symbol is indicative of the concept of how dimensionality works. I was actually have been in contact with an astronomer. She's one of the associates of Nassim Haramein. And one of the things that she's proposed in her work is the concept of energetic dimensionality. I'll try to explain to you how that works. In Hinduism, magnetic and electrical energies are manifested forms. They manifest as monopoles. Magnetism manifests in the form of 2 monopoles, which is like 2 geometric points. Electricity manifests as 1 monopole, which is one geological point. But preceding those is a domain of energy that has trifold potentiality. It's called a domain of instanton knots. Hinduism calls it Omkara. And so we're moving on the energetic side from a domain of 3 geometric points to one of 2 geometric points to one of 1 geometric point. We have a descending pace of what is the energetic equivalent of dimensionality. And at the geometric point of an electron, suddenly we have the emergence of linear dimensionality. And the difference all rests on how fast the pace of time is moving. If time moves fast enough, it looks like energy. If it moves slowly enough, it looks like materiality. When an electron orbits a hydrogen atom, a British physicist named Gamow, Gamow, documented 14 orbital paths for the electron around the hydrogen and proton. There are only 5 energy levels, but 14 orbital paths. And the difference comes up with the Zeeman effect, which creates these incremental paths. But the electron, as it moves through these paths, first of all, we see its velocity increase dramatically. But it increases without any of the effects of relativity that we would expect. So there's something else going on besides normal velocity. The Dogon perspective is that electron is moving through domains of energy where the pace of time progressively increases. And by the time it gets down to where the proton is, it's moving at almost the speed of light. And that's the same effect that happens inside of a Wakefield bubble with the object inside a Wakefield bubble doesn't violate the speed of light, even if the Wakefield bubble does, because the Wakefield bubble is energetic and the object inside of it isn't. So it looks to us like it moves very, very close to the speed of light, but without any of the relativistic effects. The electron's in the same position. It's inside a plasma bubble. And its motion, as we see it, is because the domain it's moving through has a faster time frame. That's the same reason why we measure the universe expanding ever more quickly as we look further out. It's because we're looking back into domains when time moved quicker than it does now.
All right. Does anyone else have any further questions for Laird at this time?
I just had a thought because we speak so much about the electron and how it moves and stuff. How how does this relate to photosynthesis, you think, uh, Laird, and what that
That's a
does?
good question. I haven't really examined it. I know that biological life rests on the same energetics. The Dogen flatly say that it does. I've done a lot of study of Meiwan Ho's books on organic life, which includes plant life, and there are dynamics that are occurring inside of a living creature that are the same as the dynamics that are occurring inside a plasma orb. The plasma tends to form bilayer levels where electrons and ions, positive and negative ions, basically are distanced from each other. That's exactly what happens with matter. It's the key dynamic that keeps living creatures living. So I would say biosynthesis rests on the same things. I just don't know enough about it to offer really an opinion.
I just want to add just a really funny thing. So, um, I'm ironically, because I did not actually have time lately to follow so much of what you were doing. So, I guess more coincidentally, I'm actually going to Scotland tomorrow. So, it's just like I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. I've been to Ring of Brugdor before. We're not going quite that north this time, but like I'm literally going there. So
Well, that's
yeah.
terrific. That's
Should
terrific.
I is
Say hello for us.
what?
Say hello for us.
Yeah, hey Scotland,
Better
yeah.
than me.
So there was another mound there that we're gonna visit that I'm trying to remember. They call it it's like by Sterling. I think they call it Arthur's Knot or something like that. But it also has that sort of you know several circle pattern. I'm wondering. So are they all connected, or were they all connected?
Um, the resonant mounds, many of them are placed, enough of them are placed along straight lines that in the 1800s, somebody noticed, look, we have what look like energy lines here. Why would anybody build these resonant structures here if it wasn't to access energy?
Okay, so
And then they
they would just be
mapped
all.
out where the lines were from where they're situated. I mean, things like famous chapels and things like that, famous religious sites, all
Rose
placed
line
on
and yeah.
spots that are highly energetic, ground energy and ley line energy.
Cool. So if you visit one, you can visit
How
them all.
long are you going to be in? How long are you going to be in Scotland?
Like until the
How long?
ninth, like a week and a half.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Are you going to be in Edinburgh or are you going to be other
Gonna
places?
start in Edinburgh and then go to the North Sea and then out. Oh, we're going to Isle of Arran, which I hadn't been to before, to the King's Caves.
Yes. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah. Thanks. So if you guys want anything, pictures or anything like that,
Pick me up
this was
a
awesome.
to-go order of haggis, will you?
You got it.
Yes.
I'm sure that will travel well.
Yeah. Chocolate dipped.
Chocolate chip.
Well, if anyone, I'd say we're now at the 2 hour mark. Does anyone have any additional questions? If yes, I'd say let's put them in. And
And
if
otherwise, we
not,
can wrap at this point.
yeah, if not, let everybody get away from their screens for a bit. Okay, then Laird, thank you for this presentation. Thank you to all of our guests who joined in. I will make sure to upload the recording of this to Laird's YouTube page and get some buzz going.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the people who did show up. I realized the way these things go is you invite 100 people and
10 show up, that's typical. It's okay. We do this. This happens with us with meetings locally also. 25 people respond and 10 show up.
So, yeah, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Laird.
Hey, and I just want to say hi to Riza because we met at CPAC 2014 in person, if you remember. So, yeah, it was only 12 years ago. So,
All right.
Well, nice to see you again.
good to see you.
All right.
Thanks, Laird.
Thanks,
Yeah,
guys.
thank you. Thank you all.